A woman rides across a battlefield already thick with the dead, and she is not looking for anyone to save. She is looking for someone to take. The word for her in Old Norse is Valkyrja, and the word is not a mystery, it is a job description. Valor is the slain on a field of battle. Kjosa is to choose. Put together, the name means, with no poetry added by later admirers, chooser of the slain. Rudolf Simic traces Val back through Gothic Wall into a whole family of words built around one fact: the dead belong to someone, and that someone has staked a claim on them before they even fall. That is not a title anyone gives to a rescuer. A rescuer's name announces mercy or speed or a hand reaching down. This name announces ownership filed at the moment of death. The battlefield produces a body, and the body already has a claim on it before it has finished falling. The Valkyrie is not the one who arrives to decide whether that claim is deserved. She is the mechanism the claim runs through. That root touches everything around it. Valholl, Hall of the Slain. Einherjar, those who fight alone, the dead reassembled into an army. Valfodr, Father of the Slain, one of Odin's own names for himself. Hall, army, and god are all named around the same possession of corpses. Simic's reading of the pattern is direct. This is not a system built to reward the brave. It is a system built to control the dead. A rescuer's name does not organize a hall, a warband, and a god's own title around a battlefield full of bodies. A procurement officer's does. Völuspá opens on that same title before the poem has taken a single action. Its first stanza has the seeress address Odin as Valfodr, Father of the Slain, establishing his identity as Lord of the battlefield dead before anything else about him is said. The hall's own threshold carries the root in stone, too. Grimnismal names the gate of Valholl Valgrind, Gate of the Slain, built from the same word that names the hall behind it. A Valkyrie delivering a body to that gate is not arriving at a generic entrance. She is delivering it to a door that was named for what passes through it before she was ever given a name of her own. The semantic web leaves something out, too. Nowhere in Valholl, Einherjar, or Valfodr is there a word for courage, for sacrifice, for a life well lived. The entire naming system is organized around one axis only: who has died and who now holds them. A culture building a myth about merit would have built its vocabulary around merit. This culture built its vocabulary around inventory. The oldest surviving line to put a Valkyrie in motion agrees. Völuspá, the seeress's prophecy that opens the Poetic Edda, names them in stanza 30, riding among Odin's assembly to carry out the same verb the etymology already promised. Kjosa, to choose those who will be slain, in Caroline Larrington's translation. Not to carry the wounded from the field, not to weigh mercy against duty, to choose. The Valkyrie arrives already deciding, and the poem does not pause to explain the criteria, because in the 9th or 10th century, when this stanza was first sung, no listener needed the criteria explained. Everyone already knew what a chooser did, and the verb itself is not a soft one. Kjosa is not reserved for battlefields. It is the same word Norse law uses for electing a chieftain, for a court reaching its verdict. John Lindo places the Valkyrie's choosing inside that same legal register, the register of rulings, not the register of pity. A verdict is handed down. It is not negotiated with the man it falls on, and it is not appealed. When a Valkyrie chooses a man, she is not weighing whether he deserves to live. She is executing a decision that has already been made above her, in the same voice a judge uses to close a case, or a chieftain uses to seal an election. A listener 1,000 years ago would have carried a great deal into that word. A verdict at a Norse assembly was not a private feeling. It was spoken aloud in front of witnesses, and it bound everyone standing there, whether they liked the outcome or not. That is the register a poet reached for when a Valkyrie's choosing needed a verb, not a word for comforting the dying, a word for closing a case that has already been decided somewhere else by someone with more authority than the woman delivering the verdict. Put a legal verb inside a word that already means possession of the dead, and there is no crack left for mercy to enter through. A judge does not rescue the party who loses. A judge rules, and the ruling stands. Hold the two things next to each other. A culture that wanted a battlefield angel, a figure who swoops down to carry the dying to safety, does not name her with a judicial verb and build a fortress of the dead around her title. It names a fortress after who it keeps, not who it saves. Odin's entire apparatus is a holding operation. The lovers, the shield maidens, the ones who seem for a moment to protect a man instead of taking him, every one of them still has to answer to that ownership before their story is finished. No two sources agree on the roster. Grim Nismal, Odin's own catalogue of Valholl's furniture and staff, lists 13 names in a single stanza. Hrist, Mist, Skegjold, Skogul, Hilda, Thruda, Hlok, Herfjotr, Gol, Geironul, Randgrid, Radgrid, Regenlife, women who serve ale to the einherjar and ride out to choose among the slain. That double duty is worth sitting with. The same figures pouring drink in the hall are the ones deciding hours earlier who gets carried into it. A tavern keeper and an executioner occupying the same 13 bodies. Voluspa, composed independently of Grimnismal, gives its own list in stanzas 30 and 31, Skuld, Skogul, Gondul, Geirskogul, Hilda among them. Set the two lists side by side, and only two names survive the crossing, Skogul and Hilda. Everyone else is unique to their poem. Snorri Sturluson, writing his Prose Edda around 1220, adds a third list, Hrist, Mist, Hlok, Herfjotr, Gol, Geironul, Skogul, and more, overlapping with both earlier catalogues in places, matching neither exactly, and stating outright that these women choose who shall die and who shall have victory in battle. In Anthony Fawkes' translation, 3 lists, 3 centuries or more of scribal transmission apart, and 1 overlapping pair of names. No agreement anywhere close to complete. And Snorri, writing as a Christian compiler 200 years after conversion, is not copying a fixed catalogue so much as assembling one, the way a chronicler assembles a genealogy from fragments that were never meant to be read side by side. Rudolf Simek and John Lindo, working through the full run of Eddic and skaldic poetry, count at least 29 distinct Valkyrie names across every source that survives, and no single poem or saga ever lists more than 13 at once. There is no master roll call anywhere in the corpus, no text sat down to fix the number, the way a genealogy fixes a royal line. What that absence implies matters more than any one name on it. A fixed pantheon gets a fixed list, sooner or later, in someone's hand. A function does not. The Valkyries were never closed into a caste the way a settled pantheon of gods is. They were an open office, filled by however many names a given poet's tradition happened to carry. New names could be minted by a skald in a single stanza and never repeated again, and the corpus would not object because there was no roll to strike them from. The names themselves confirm what the openness suggests. Most are not proper names in the way Odin or Thor are proper names. They are battle events, given a woman's shape. Hilda means simply battle. Skogul means the shaker, or the high-towering one. Herfjotr, a name whose full cruelty the record has not yet shown, means army fetter. Gol means screaming or noise. Gondul means wand wielder. Simek reads this naming pattern as the tell. These figures began as personifications of what happens on a battlefield, not as individuals with biographies. A scream given a name is not a person. It is a sound the battlefield makes, dressed in a woman's form so a poet had someone to send riding across the sky. Not every name works as a battle-kenning, though. Regenleaf, the 13th name Grimnismal gives, means something closer to power truce. An inheritance from the ruling powers themselves, not a sound off the field. And Simek reads it as a single roster mixing registers, battle event names standing beside names that imply standing and delegation. The lists are not even consistent about family. Thruda, among Grimnismal's 13, is elsewhere named a daughter of Thor, the same word attached to 2 figures depending on the poem. Voluspa shows the women armed, not merely named. Its 30th stanza has Skuld riding with a shield, Skogul beside her, both equipped for a fight the poem has not yet described. That is what it does to the word roster itself. A roster of soldiers has faces, ranks, home villages. A roster of battle sounds has none of that, and does not need it. Screaming does not require childhood. A fetter does not require a father. 13 names in one poem, 6 in another, 29 across the whole surviving literature, and not one biography among them. No text records where Herfjotr was born, or what Gondul feared, because the question does not apply to the thing being named. An ordinary human woman, elsewhere in the wider literary tradition, gets a farm, a father, a marriage, a feud. Valkyrie names get none of that scaffolding in these earliest lists. They get a single word, doing a single job, and then the poem moves on to the next name, doing the next job. Valkyries met later, Svava, Sigrun, Sigurdrifa do get a father, a farm, a lover, and the gap between those figures and the 30 bare names given here is not an accident of survival. It is the seam where one tradition ends and a different, later one begins. None of this erases the coherence the category does have. The disagreement between lists may owe as much to regional cult and local poetic habit as to any real conceptual chaos, and that qualification matters as much as the chaos itself. But 30 names and no agreed faces gives something specific, not a cast of characters. A function worn by however many masks a given telling required, and a function, unlike a person, does not need to rescue anyone to keep doing its job. A list of 30 names raises the question of what a name list, on its own, can actually tell an audience. Herfjotr answers it. Army-Fetter. It sits in the census of Valkyrie names in Grimnismal 36, next to Hilda and Gaul and the rest. A name like that is not decoration. A battle-kenning that means bringer of screaming or maiden of battle can still describe a witness, but a fetter cannot. A fetter is a thing done to a body. Rudolf Simic reads it as a description of an act, a supernatural restraint thrown over an army, seizing the limbs of living men so they stand rooted while the killing reaches them, not a spirit who arrives once the dying is done, a spirit who arrives first and makes the dying possible. Helga Kvida Hundingsbana, I gives the verb. Olli, she caused. The poem shows a Valkyrie riding over the field and casting the fetter. And Eog Turvil Petra reads the line as evidence that this figure kills directly, rather than choosing afterward from among the already fallen. Choosing and causing stop being two acts. They are the same gesture, seen from two sides. The selection is the killing, performed in the same motion, by the same hand. The word survives outside Iceland too, carried into a language that had already stopped believing in her. Old English glosses translate Welsurge as Furia, as Bellona, as Erinis, Roman and Greek names for the same office. A woman whose presence on a battlefield is itself the danger. Neil Price, in the Viking way, places the Norse Valkyrie inside this wider Germanic family of battlefield women, and every cognate in it names a bringer of death, never a rescuer. The etymology travels across centuries and across languages, and lands in the same place each time it is checked. Price goes further, and this is his argument and not settled fact. He connects the fetter to a documented Norse tradition of battle magic worked mostly by women, and reads the paralysis on the battlefield as belief made narrative, a real practice, projected onto a supernatural figure who could do at cosmic scale what a human practitioner claimed to do at human scale. Turvil Petra traces a parallel tradition under the same name, Herfjotr, appearing across poetry and saga as a named affliction. Men struck still by something with no visible cause, unable to lift a shield or turn from a blow already coming. He treats it as evidence of belief in a real battlefield paralysis. The poems themselves only ever show the effect, never a mechanism, so the claim stays an inference drawn from image rather than a documented practice. Sigurdrifumal shows the mechanism the fetter serves once it is cast. In its 6th and 7th stanzas, Sigurdrifa teaches victory runes, Sigrunar, and the poem states plainly that a Valkyrie who knows them can turn a battle regardless of what has already been decreed. Odin's word is not the only lever in the room. The Valkyrie holds one too, and she is the one standing close enough to the men, closer than Odin ever gets, to use it. The god sits at a distance and decides. She rides into the press of shields and applies the decision to a body. She rides marked by the work already. Helga Kvida Jorvatssonar shows Svava crossing sea and land with her helmet dripping blood, not a figure descending clean onto a finished field, but one already inside the carnage before the poem's audience meets her. Helga Kvida Hundingsbana Andis, in its 16th stanza, shows fire shivering off the Valkyrie spears as they ride, a light that goes ahead of them rather than behind, announcing what is coming before it arrives. And in Helga Kvida Hundingsbana Farj, Sigrun stands present at the deaths of Hundings' sons, named men falling in her company. Not a myth about death in general, but about this man, and then this one, and then the next. Voluspa gives the grammar for all of it. Stanza 30 uses the phrase Kjosa Val to choose the slain. and in Jackson Crawford's rendering, the choosing is forward-facing, not sorting corpses, but selecting outcomes before the outcome exists. The stanzas just before it, 28 through 30, place the whole apparatus inside a larger clock. Hilda Ellis Davidson reads this eschatological frame as the reason any of it is happening at all. Odin has already been told he loses at the end of the world, and the fetter, the runes, the riders with blood on their helmets, are how he stocks an army for a battle. The same poem says he cannot win. Every warrior she freezes today is a soldier for a war already lost on paper, recruited by a god who knows the ending and is stocking the field for it anyway. None of this required a poet to invent cruelty. Every restraint, every rune, every drop of blood already on a helmet before the fighting starts comes from a line a scribe copied down centuries ago and a scholar since has had to account for. The Valkyrie of the Battle-Fetter is not a monster added to soften the record. She is what the record already says, read at the pace the words actually move. No embellishment was needed to make her Fjotr frightening. The name already meant what it meant. That is the shape of the chooser now. Not a witness standing over the dead. A cause standing over the living, with a deadline she did not set and cannot move. 12 women at a loom. Njal's Saga, chapter 157, names the poem woven into its prose as Dara-Daljod, and describes the loom itself. The warp strung from human entrails, weights of severed heads hanging at the bottom, a sword for a shuttle, arrows for the rods that beat the weave tight. Nothing here is figurative armor laid over an ordinary image, the way a poet might call a sword a wound hoe and mean nothing more by it. The materials are named as what they are. Entrails, heads, a sword doing a shuttle's work, because in this weaving room, a shuttle is what a sword is for. The poem opens before any of those bodies exist. Its first stanzas, in Robert Cook's translation, call the work the loom of slaughter, cloud dark, the web of spears. Language describing a battle that has not started. The weavers are not recording a result. They are building toward one, the way any weaver works a pattern that does not yet exist on the loom in front of them until the shuttle has passed enough times to make it exist. 4 of the names given for them in stanza 4, Hilda, Gondul, Garskagul, among others, are names already on record elsewhere in the census given by Grimnismal and Voluspa. These are not a separate order of spirit invented for one saga scene. They are the same figures the earlier lists named, doing here in full close view what those lists only implied at a distance. The census gave names without faces. This poem gives one of those names a loom, a task, and blood to the elbow. Their refrain says what they are doing in the present tense while it is still happening. Vindum, vindum vef darida. We wind the web of the spear. Not a chant looking backward at a finished thing, the kind sung once the outcome is safe to name. A crew narrating its own labor as the labor continues, and the battle continuing with it, stanza by stanza, thread by thread. Simic reads the poem's logic the same way. These Valkyries do not wait for men to fall and then describe the falling. The falling is what the weaving produces. Karen Beck-Pedersen's study of Old Norse fate weaving treats this as the tradition's clearest statement of a single principle running under the whole cosmology. That cloth and fate are made by the same motion on the same instrument, and the loom does not describe an outcome. It manufactures one. When it's done, they tear it apart. The poem's closing stanzas show the 12 ripping the finished web and riding off, 6 to the north, 6 to the south, the moment the battle's outcome is set. They do not linger to escort anyone from the field, and no wounded man is comforted in these lines. They arrive for the making and leave the instant the making is finished, which tells its own version of what the Valkyrie is for. Not a companion to the dying, an operator who steps away from a mechanism once it has produced the result it was built to produce. E.O.G. Tevilpetra reads the loom itself as a hinge point in the wider mythology. The same image, a web, a weaving, fate rendered as fabric, belongs elsewhere in the corpus to the Norns, the 3 who are said to set the terms of every life at its beginning, and Tevilpetra argues that Dara-Daljod is where the boundary between Valkyrie and Norn stops holding. 2 categories treated as separate everywhere else in the record start sharing an instrument here, and a poem about one battle turns out to be evidence about the shape of fate itself. The saga frames the poem as history. A man named Dorudr watches the 12 through a window. Cook's translation notes that when they finish and ride off, he finds the loom and the entrails lying on the ground, and Njal's saga frames the whole vision as an eyewitness account tied to the Battle of Clontarf, fought in Ireland around 1014, though scholars read the poem itself as mythological material set into that historical frame, not a report of it. Rudolf Simek notes that the dating of the poem itself against that saga context is disputed. Some scholars place it earlier than Clontarf and fold it in afterward. Others read it as composed for the saga around it. And the disagreement matters because the prose frame wants it read as an eyewitness account of a real mourning, while the poem's own content belongs to myth. A saga can set a myth beside a real battle and let the two sit close together on the page. It cannot make the myth into a document of what actually happened that morning outside Dublin. What the loom shows is what the culture believed determined a battle's outcome, not a transcript of one. Nothing about the loom needs to be softened to be born, and nothing needs to be sharpened either. 12 women hold a battle's outcome in their hands, work it thread by thread on a frame strung from the men it will kill, and leave the field the instant the pattern is complete. That is the whole of it, stated at the weight the poem itself gives it, no more and no less. The weavers who make an outcome, and the Norns who are already understood to spin one. By the end of this poem, the line between them has gone thin enough to ask whether it was ever a real line to begin with, or only a name for two jobs no one had yet noticed were the same job. Skuld appears twice in the same poem under two different job descriptions. In Völuspá's 20th stanza, she is one of 3 Norns at the well, carving the fates of men. In its 30th stanza, a Valkyrie roster rides past, and Skuld's name is called again, this time among the choosers of the slain. It's the hardest piece of textual evidence for a boundary the poem itself never draws. One name, doing both jobs, inside a single work. The other 2 Norns have work that reads like weather made into law. Edda, what has become, Verdandi, what is becoming, and Skuld, what shall be, carve runes at Edda's well and lay down laws. Choose lives for the sons of men. Set out fates. Choose lives. It is the same verb the Valkyrie uses over a corpse. The rune carving at the well and the choosing on the battlefield are the same act performed at 2 different distances from a body. One seated, one riding, both before the fact. The overlap runs down into the Valkyrie's own vocabulary. Sigurdrifa, waking Sigurd on the mountain, teaches him Norn runes, carved, she tells him, by the Norns themselves onto the shield of the sun horse Arvakr, and says a wise Valkyrie ought to know them. She does not claim to write fate. She claims to carry the tool fate uses, and to know how it is used. Her own story admits the categories bend further than that. She was put to sleep as punishment for a battlefield choice that overrode Odin's decree. Punished, in other words, for behaving like a Norn while employed as a Valkyrie. Diswork the same seam from the family side rather than the battlefield side. In Atlamal, dead women call themselves Gunnar's Desir and come to him in a dream to tell him what has already been decided about his death. They are never named Valkyries. They perform the Valkyrie's exact function, foreseeing, announcing, arriving at the threshold before the fact, under a household word instead of a battlefield one. No poet stops to explain the substitution. The Atlamal poet reaches for Desir the way another poet reaches for Valkyrja, and the death still arrives on schedule either way. Rudolf Simek finds Valkyrja treated as a plain synonym for dis in skaldic kennings, one poet's battle dis, doing precisely the work another poet assigns to a chooser of the slain. Judy Quinn's reading of Heimdallr pushes the same figure 1 register further still, arguing that the vulva who speaks fate in that poem draws on the same supernatural authority the Norn carves and the Valkyrie enacts. 3 job titles laid over one power. None of this is disorder for its own sake. Fafnismal has the dying dragon ask which Norns attended a man's birth, and the answer fragments the tidy threefold structure on contact. Not all are of one kin. Some of the Aesir, some of the elves, some the daughters of Dvalin. Sigurd does not correct himself back to Völuspá's 3 names. He answers in lineages, Aesir, elves, dwarves, as if the question had always had more than one honest answer. Some manuscript traditions push the overlap all the way to the end of the world. One version of Voluspa's 47th stanza names Gondul among the forces gathering as Ragnarok begins, and the same name called on the roster in stanza 30, and the same name that answers Odin in the praise poetry to come. Not every edition of the poem preserves the line this way, and the case for a named Valkyrie standing at the end of everything is stronger as a pattern across the corpus than as one certain stanza. Even taken cautiously, it points the same direction as everything else here. Wherever the sources let the Valkyrie's edges show, they blur into fate work rather than harden into a uniform. There is a reading that says none of this proves anything except how organized the whole system already was. Margaret Clooney's Ross argues the opposite, that the clean three-way split between Norn, Dis, and Valkyrja is not an archaic structure recovered from the poems at all, but a rationalization promoted largely by Snorri Sturluson's own systematizing project, 2 centuries after most of the poetry was composed. If Clooney's Ross is right, the very source relied on to tell the categories apart is the source that invented the categories. The thesis cannot claim to have found some pure, ancient job description hiding under the mess. The mess may be closer to the original condition than the taxonomy is. Either the boundary was never drawn, or it was drawn once, late, by a Christian mythographer working from the outside. Neither answer leaves the tidy chart, Norn in one column, Dis in another, Valkyrja in her own, standing. What the oldest material offers before anyone sorted it is not 3 professions. It is one power, worked at 3 different distances from a body, the well, the dream, the battlefield, and a single figure moving freely between them because the line had not yet been drawn. She belongs to the machinery that decides, not to the army that gets decided about. Take the wish maidens out of Valholl's doorway and set them back on the ground where men actually die, and the picture changes. Hilda Ellis Davidson argues that behind the literary Valkyrie, the one who serves ale and calls heroes by name, lies an older stratum of belief. Supernatural women who haunt the battlefield itself, whose business is with the corpses lying on it, not with a hole waiting somewhere beyond it. She connects the figure to the Irish Morrigan and to comparable battlefield spirit traditions elsewhere in the Germanic and Celtic world, proposing an archetype considerably older than any Icelandic manuscript, and older than Valholl's Golden Hall itself. The comparison is not settled scholarship. Davidson's method, reading Norse and Irish material side by side on functional grounds rather than demonstrated historical contact, has drawn caution from other historians of the North. But if she is right, the gracious figure greeting the einherjar at Valholl's door is a later, tamed version of something that began at the corpse itself. The Valkyries do not simply act in Voluspa. First, they're seen. In the poem's 28th stanza, it is the Volva, speaking from beyond her own death, who reports the sight of Valkyries riding toward battle, describing them in the same prophetic mode she uses for every other event she narrates. The Valkyrie here is not yet a participant with a name and a lover. She is an object inside somebody else's vision. One supernatural woman watching another perform the work of death, at a remove that keeps her closer to the older, stranger stratum Ellis Davidson describes than to the courtly wish maiden waiting a few chapters ahead. The skaldic vocabulary keeps the older, rougher sense alive long after the poetry had moved on from it. Court poets call Valkyries hrafnasir, raven goddesses, tying them directly to the birds that follow an army to its corpse feast, and through the ravens to Odin's own Hugin and Munin. Rudolf Simic reads the kenning as proof that the Valkyrie's beauty, wherever the later texts choose to locate it, was built over a figure whose original association was carrion, not courtesy. Njal's Saga still knows this 3 centuries later. Its prose frame around Daradaliod has ravens flying at the exact moment the Valkyrie weavers appear at their loom, and the saga makes nothing of the coincidence. It does not need to. A 13th century Icelandic writer could set Raven and Valkyrie side by side and trust his audience to feel the connection without a gloss, which means the association was still common currency long after the belief that produced it had gone underground. A saga writer working generations after the pagan period could still reach for the Raven goddess pairing as ordinary atmosphere, not as an antiquarian footnote. Ellis Davidson pushes the older stratum one step further, and it is the harder of her 2 claims. She argues that the Valkyrie's earliest recoverable function was not choosing at all, but handling, direct physical contact with the dead on the field, and that the elegant selecting Grimnismal later describes is a refinement of that older, more visceral belief. Set the loom of guts and skulls Adara Daljod against that claim, and it stops reading as a poet's conceit. Entrails as warp thread is not a metaphor if the tradition behind it already imagined women standing over the body itself, hands on it, before any poet turned that contact into an image. The comparative Irish evidence Davidson leans on here draws the same caution as before, and other historians of the North treat the parallel as suggestive, rather than demonstrated. What the later court poetry did with this material was formalize it into a working vocabulary, safe for use in a king's hall. Snorri's Skaldskaparmal lists the approved kennings a trained skald could reach for: Odin's girls, spear goddesses, and Oskamejjar, wish maidens. Oskamejjar is the more revealing coinage of the three. Osk means wish or desire, and the word sits inside the same family as Odin's own wish names, his Osknir. A wish maiden is not etymologically a free agent. She is built into the god's desire before she is anything else. His want, given a shape, sent out to act on a battlefield, he does not walk himself. By the time the kennings had settled into a working court vocabulary, spear goddess, Odin's girl, wish maiden, the older woman who touched the corpses, had been folded into a poet's toolkit, available on demand. None of this argues that Grimnismal's courtly Valkyrie is a fiction, or that the ale-bearing wish maiden is decoration with nothing underneath it. It argues that the decoration has a flaw. Under the armored figure who greets the einherjar sits a raven that has already fed, a woman whose earliest role may have been touching the body rather than choosing it, and a watcher glimpsed only through somebody else's prophecy before she ever had a name of her own. The hall dresses her, it does not invent her. Behind Grimnismal's list of names serving ale in a bright hall, the sources keep surfacing an older figure standing on colder ground. Odin wakes from a dream he does not explain, and orders the benches of his hall set, the wine vessels filled, Valkyries summoned to their stations. At the moment the poem stages this, the king he is preparing for is still alive, still fighting, on a beach at Stainmore in the north of England. Erica Blodox will not die there for some lines yet, but the god is already awake, already giving orders, already certain. The poem that stages Odin's foreknowledge, Eiriksmal, was composed for a Norwegian court around 954, after the fact, but it tells the death as something Odin already knew was coming before any messenger could have reached Valhall with the news. The poem survives only inside later sagas, Fagerskina and Heimskringla among them, copied and recopied by scribes who were not there for Stainmore either. What survives is the best available version of a court composition, not a certain transcript of one. 7 years later, a second court commissions a second poem. Eyvind Finsen writes Hakonarmal for Hakon the Good, and in it, 2 Valkyries, Gondul and Skogul, ride out to the battle at Fitjar to choose among the kings of the Yngling line which one comes home with them. Odin sends them by name for a named task. The poem does not leave the commission implicit. It states it in the opening stanzas as plainly as a court poem states anything. Skogul rides beside Gondul, named in the same commission by the same god, though the poem gives her no line of her own to speak. The responsibility of the choosing distributed across 2 named figures, one of whom the surviving text never lets us hear. The poem itself carries no author's name at the front of it, an anonymous composition addressed entirely to its royal audience and to no one else. And its Hakonarmal counterpart is blunter than atmosphere allows. Gondul tells the king outright that the gods themselves have chosen him tonight to come and join their number. That is a claim stated, not implied. Hakon, dying, asks why, if the gods favored him, the battle went against him at all. It is a scene with no real counterpart elsewhere in the surviving corpus. A king interrogating a Valkyrie directly about the mechanics of his own fate and being given an answer. Gondul answers first that it was his own men's courage that failed him, not divine withdrawal. It is a strange answer for a supposed patron to give. And elsewhere in the same poem, she says something stranger still, that she and her companion guarded his life. Of every line assigned to a Valkyrie in the surviving Norse corpus, This is the one that argues hardest against everything the etymology promised in the opening chapter. A chooser of the slain, claiming, to the dying man himself, to have kept him alive. The scholar Tervil Petra calls it the closest Norse poetry ever comes to a Valkyrie as protector, and he reads it as a feature of the genre, not of the myth. A court poem flatters a dead patron, and flattery reaches for whatever language serves the king's memory best. That is an argument, not a correction to the text. The line stands, spoken in the poem exactly as written. What can be said, honestly, is only that it stands inside a form built to console a grieving court, and has not been found standing anywhere else in the corpus. Hilda Ellis Davidson's reading of both poems together makes the shape of that form explicit. In Eiríksmal and in Hakonarmal alike, composed for two different royal houses within a decade of each other, the Valkyrie's task is folded into a courtly purpose, turning a king's death in battle into proof that the king was chosen, not merely killed. Eyvinder himself served a court that had already begun to turn Christian. Ellis Davidson notes that his use of pagan Valkyrie imagery reads as a poet reaching for an inherited vocabulary, not making a confession of belief. By 961, the Valkyrie is already doing cultural and political work independent of whatever anyone left in the hall still believed about her. The poem does not end at the battle. It follows Hakon in to a hall where the gods and the einherjar receive him as one of their own, already assembled, already waiting. Not a newcomer being welcome to rest, but a soldier being welcome to a company. And its final stanza turns from the funeral to the future. Property is lost like cattle, kinsmen die, the land is laid waste, and Hakon, the poem says, will be standing there again when the gods' own halls come down at the end of the world. A court poem commissioned to comfort the living for one king's death closes unexpectedly by naming the battle every king recruited into Valholl is actually being kept for. Not a place Hakon has earned a rest in, but a muster he has just been added to. 540 doors, 800 warriors walking abreast through each one when the wolf finally comes. That is the number Grimnismal gives for the army Valholl is built to hold, and it is not a number that describes a reward for a life well lived. It describes a mobilization, sized for a single, specific engagement. Multiply the doors by the warriors, and the total comes to something over 400,000, a figure too precise to read as poetic ornament, and too large to explain as a reward system for even the most generous god in the corpus. Snorri's prose makes the architecture literal, not decorative. The roof is shields, the rafters are spear shafts, the benches are strewn with coats of mail instead of cloaks. Nothing in the hall is furniture. Everything in it is equipment, and everyone sleeping under it is sleeping inside a weapon store. A goat named Hydron stands on the roof and fills a vat with mead that never runs dry, enough to keep every warrior in the hall drinking his fill without depleting the supply, and the same women who ride out to choose the slain carry that mead to the tables when they return from choosing. Chooser and server are not two roles handed out to two different kinds of women. Grimnismal gives them, in a single stanza, to the same figure. Snorri's own phrasing for the choosing itself is worth holding on to for its precision. The Valkyries, he writes, choose those men who are to be slain and govern the victory, not simply pick a winner after the outcome is decided, but govern the outcome. The daily routine confirms what the number already suggested. Every morning the einherjar arm themselves, go out into the yard, and fight until they have cut each other to pieces. Every evening the dead among them ride back healed, and the whole company sits down to eat as if the morning had not happened. It is not an afterlife of rest, repeated for eternity out of generosity. It is drill, repeated without end, for troops who need to be ready on a day that has not yet come. Snorri states the commissioning outright. Odin sends the Valkyries to every battlefield in the world for this purpose alone, and to keep that yard staffed. Tervil Peter's reading of the whole arrangement is blunt. These are not heroes enjoying a paradise they earned through virtue in life. They are soldiers conscripted into a training program, and the program exists because it has a deadline. The deadline is the point of everything built so far. Before the end, Odin rides out to Mimir's well and takes counsel from the severed head kept there, a god seeking advice from the dead, on the eve of the one battle he cannot afford to lose, which is not a thing a god does about an outcome he already expects to win. Voluspa has already told him what is coming. He falls to Fenrir at the end, in front of everyone he has spent an age assembling. Hilda Ellis Davidson reads the entire hall, and every warrior recruited into it, as built around that single foreknown defeat. Odin gathers the finest of the human dead across the whole of history, not because he is generous, but because a wolf is going to kill him, and he has been told so in advance, with enough time to prepare an army and not enough time to prevent the fight. Not a monster he might survive, one he will not. He is not even the only recruiter running this operation. Snorri records that half of every battle's dead go instead to Folkvanger, the field that belongs to Freya, who chooses her own share by the same right Odin claims for his, a second hall, staffed by a second procurement system and a claim on the slain her worshippers made independently of Odin's. And when Völuspá finally shows the world after the battle, the new earth rising out of the sea, a single human pair walking into a world with no one left to rule it, the einherjar are not standing there among the survivors. Neither are the Valkyries who chose them. The poem that gave this whole apparatus its purpose simply stops mentioning either of them, as if the question of what happened to them had already been answered by the silence. Whatever this army was built for, it was spent completely, down to the women who staffed it. Every warrior recruited into that hall, and every Valkyrie who did the recruiting, exists for one single use. And the use, in the end, is not survival. Theirs or anyone's. Not every Valkyrie in this story stays that anonymous, though. Some of them, it turns out, have names their lovers used, fathers who grieved them, and choices that cost them everything a functionary is not supposed to have to lose. Helgi Hjorvardsson has no name at the start of his own poem. Helgakvida Hjorvardssonar gives him nothing until a Valkyrie rides down and gives him one, along with a sword. Her name is Svava. The naming is not a courtesy. It is a fate assignment, the same act a Norn performs when she carves a future into wood. A man in this cycle can be nameless and undecided. A Valkyrie's attention is what fixes him. Svava becomes his betrothed, a status none of the 30 names in the earlier census carries. Those names have kennings and battle functions. Svava has a wedding pending and a household to run. Then the poem does something the census list poems never do. It tells her what is coming before it happens to him. She sees that Helgi will die the night he accepts a stranger's challenge to single combat, and she does not stop him from leaving. Helgakvida Hjorvardssonar renders her foreknowledge as passive. She knows, and she does not intervene. There is no scene of her arguing him out the door, no bargaining with the man who will kill him. She has the sight of a Norn and the standing of neither wife nor mother, no claim on him strong enough to overrule what she has already seen. When the wound proves fatal, Svava reaches him in time to receive his last words. That is the whole of what her power buys him in the end. Not survival, but a witness who loved him and heard what he had left to say. A chooser standing over a name on a list does not need to hear anything. Svava does, and the poem makes her wait for it. The second Valkyrie in the cycle is named on her first appearance, and the poem does not make the audience wait for it. Helgakvida Hundingsbana. I opens with 12 mounted women crossing the sky, light breaking around them, and their leader is Sigrun, daughter of King Hogni. She has a father, a rank, and, within a few stanzas, a name for the hero watching her ride over. Stanzas 17 and 18 have her address Helgi Hundingsbani directly, an exchange of identification that does not happen anywhere in the name lists of Grimnismal or Völuspá. Those lists give 13 names and 6 names and no faces to go with any of them. This poem gives one Valkyrie a voice, a father, and a reason to speak first. A Valkyrie who only chooses does not need a hero to know who she is. This one wants him to. She rides down out of a sky full of armed anonymous women, and in the space of 2 stanzas, becomes the only one of them whose name the audience will remember by the end of the poem. Then comes a passage that argues the other way entirely. At the Battle of Frekastein, Sigrun holds her shield over Helgi's ships and turns aside the arrows aimed at his fleet. Helgakvida Hundingsbana Fyrhams, stanzas 28 to 30, describes this without ambiguity. Not a vision of what will happen to him, not a name added to a list afterward, but a shield raised over living men in the middle of a fight. It is not a chooser marking a man for the hall. It is a Valkyrie physically intervening to keep a warrior alive through a battle he survives. Nothing else in the corpus states the opposite of the census lists this plainly. If it is right that the word Valkyrja means selection and not rescue, this scene is the exception that word cannot explain away. And the honest response is not to argue it out of the poem, but to notice what has changed to make it possible. Sigrun is not anonymous. She has a name, a father, a man she has chosen for herself rather than for Odin. The individual Valkyrie, once she is a character and not a function, can apparently want something the office does not. And the poem lets her act on it for one battle before it takes the wanting away from her entirely. What she wants does not survive the poem. Helgi dies at the hand of Sigrun's own brother, Dagar, in a killing the poem frames as unforgivable even by the standards of a warrior cycle. Kinslaying dressed as combat. In Helgakvida hundingsbana de su. So, Sigrun's lament curses Daga by name and mourns that everything she can do, the sight, the shield raised at Freckestein, her own standing among the recruiters of the hall, cannot touch the decree that killed him. She has all the powers of her kind, sight beyond a battlefield's edge, a shield that can turn arrows, standing among the women who staff Odin's hall. None of them reverses a death once it has landed. The poem does not let her sight or her shield make the smallest difference to a decree she is, in the end, still serving. The poem does not end there. A servant reports seeing Helgi ride toward his own burial mound with a great company behind him. Riders where there should be none. Sigrun goes to the mound and waits for him in the dark. Helgi arrives, and Helgakvida hundingsbana the Sexinkunj is explicit about the terms of what follows. They have one night, not a return, not a reversal of anything the earlier stanzas decided. One night, inside the mound, before he rides back at dawn to the hall that owns him now. In the morning he is gone again, and this time Sigrun does not follow him into it. Between the stanzas, not inside them, a prose note claims the two were later reborn. It's a gloss, not a verse, added by a hand no one can date with confidence, and it carries less weight than anything spoken in the poem's own meter. What the verse itself gives is smaller and harder. A name, a shield raised once, a single night in a grave. That is what the romantic Valkyrie is allowed to keep. On a mountain called Hinderfjall, Sigurd the Dragon Slayer finds a wall of shields, and inside it a figure so completely encased in armor that the byrnie has grown into the skin beneath it. He has to cut it free. Throat to hem, the poem says, as if unsealing something rather than undressing it. There is no wound in the telling, no blood, only years of iron fused to a body that has not aged inside it. When the metal comes away, she does not speak first to him. Sigurdrifumal has her look at the sky and recite a blessing to all the worlds before she gives her own name. It is Sigurdrifa. What she tells him next is the reason she was sealed there. She gave victory to a man Odin had not chosen for it, in a battle whose outcome he had already decided, and he answered her defiance with a sleepthorn and this armor. The Valkyrie who disrupted the procurement system was, in the plainest sense, decommissioned, put out of service inside her own skin until a stranger's knife let her out. She names her own crime before Sigurd can ask about it, as if the confession has been waiting inside the armor as long as she has. She does not leave empty-handed, or leave Sigurd that way either. Sigurdrifumal has her teach him 8 kinds of runes before the poem moves on. Runes for victory, for ale, for birth, for the sea, for a branch, for speech, for the mind, for life. 8 disciplines, one after another, from a figure who a few stanzas earlier could not move. This is not battlefield knowledge alone. It is closer to a full curriculum, war and healing and navigation, and thought held in one figure, which is part of what makes Odin's silencing of her a loss, and not only a punishment. He did not simply bench a soldier, he shelved a library. Everything Sigurd will need for the rest of his life, he receives in a single scene from a woman who was, until an hour before, sealed inside her own armor on a mountain no one visited. Here is where the sources stop walking together. Sigurdrifumal never once calls this woman Brynhildr. Volsunga Saga does. Its 21st chapter restages the same ascent, the same fire, the same sleepthorn, and the same grievance, but names her outright and adds a scene the poem does not have. Sigurd and Brynhildr exchange a betrothal oath on the mountain, a promise the earlier verse never records. Simek treats this identification as a later editorial conflation, one text's synthesis of a figure the older poem left unnamed. It is worth saying plainly what that means. Brynhildr the Valkyrie, as most people have heard the story, is partly a saga writer's decision made after Sigurdrifumal was composed, stitching a rune teacher on a mountain to a tragic queen at a royal court, because the shape of the 2 stories was close enough to invite it. Part of why the saga had room to make that decision is a hole in the record itself. In Codex Regius, the manuscript that carries most of the Poetic Edda, a run of leaves is missing between 2 of the Sigurd poems. The Great Lacuna. Larrington calls it in her edition's introduction. Whatever verses once bridged the betrothal and the catastrophe are simply gone. Not summarized, not paraphrased by a scribe, just absent from the manuscript that survived. What fills the gap now is Volsunga Saga's prose, written by someone working, perhaps, from poems the rest of us no longer have. A witness of unknown reliability standing in for verses that no longer exist. Every scene that follows depends on trusting that witness. What that prose gives us, reliable or not, is the fullest Valkyrie in the entire corpus. Chapter 29 of Volsunga Saga stages a quarrel between Brynhildr and Gudrun at the river, over which of their husbands is the greater man, and it is this quarrel, not a battlefield, not a decree from Odin, that ends in Brynhildr's resolve to have Sigurdr killed. She achieves it through the ordinary machinery of a royal household. Grievance, persuasion, the men around her acting on her word rather than any spear she raises herself. No shield work here, no sky crossing, nothing visible on an open battlefield at all. The Valkyries' old power was choosing who lived on a battlefield, an ocean away from any court. Here it has become something colder and entirely human, the power to make other people do the choosing for her. She narrates her own case only once, and nowhere else in the surviving literature does a Valkyrie do this at all. Hel-ride Brynhildr, Brynhildr's ride to Hel, has her ride toward the underworld after her death, stopped by a giantess who accuses her, and answering with her own account of her career, the punishment, the sleep, and her claim that Sigurdr was the only man she would ever have married. A figure who elsewhere is a name on a list, or a shield raised over someone else's ships, here speaks for herself, in her own defense, to a stranger on the road to Hel who has no reason to believe her, and no power to judge her either. Her death is the last thing she arranges, and she arranges it like a decree. Volsunga Saga's 31st chapter has her stab herself and ask to be burned on Sigurdr's own pyre, with a sword laid between their bodies exactly as it lay between them in life. It is not a death that happens to her. It is composed, symbolic, deliberate, and the same perspective intention a Valkyrie once brought to a battlefield, turned at the very end on her own body instead of someone else's. The woman Odin once overruled, overrules everyone, one last time, on her way out of the story. Svava did not stop loving a man who was going to die. Sigrun did not stop riding for one. None of that is taken back here, and none of it needs to be. What it dates is not the love. Tervild Petra reads the Helgi cycles named loving protective Valkyries as a later development in the tradition than the anonymous Battle-Fetters. The individualization itself, the name, the Kingfather, the love, is the literary layer added on top of an older figure who had none of it. It is the frame a modern audience carries into those scenes without knowing the frame arrived 9 centuries after the poems did. And dating that frame precisely turns out to matter because it tells us where the audience's assumptions came from, which is not where the audience thinks. Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle premiered complete at Bayreuth in the summer of 1876, 4 operas built across 2.5 decades, and out of it came the single most influential Valkyrie the modern world has ever seen. More people now know her from an opera house in Bavaria than from a manuscript in Reykjavik. His Brynhildr is built from Sigurdrifa. The name changed, the Bernie kept, and she is ordered by Wotan to hand victory to a warrior named Sigmund, then defies the order out of love for the woman Sigmund is protecting. Her punishment is sleep on a fire-ringed mountain, and the opera asks the audience to feel that punishment as a father's heartbreak at a daughter who chose compassion over obedience. Grief answering grief, love answering love, on a stage built specifically to hold that scale of feeling. Sigurdrifamal tells a narrower story than that, and a colder one. Rudolf Simic is exact about the distance between them. The Valkyrie in the actual source text is stripped of her role for handing victory to the wrong king, a political error weighed and sentenced as a political error, filed and settled, the way a court settles a breach of contract, not a crime of the heart answered with heartbreak. Wagner did not invent that inversion out of nothing, and the honest telling says so plainly. Hilda Ellis Davidson traces almost a century of preparation running ahead of him. Friedrich de la Motte Fouque's Shield Maidens in the early 1800s, riding through German romantic fiction long before Wagner set a note to paper. Matthew Arnold's grieving verses on the death of Balder, written for an English readership hungry for a tragic Norse afterlife. A slow accumulation of literary material that was already reshaping the Valkyrie into a woman who loves across the boundary, separating the living from the dead. Decades before Wagner ever picked up the thread and gave it a stage, an orchestra, and a name the whole world would recognize. Alongside the literature ran a politics that wanted the same figure for a different reason entirely. John Lindo traces how the 19th century romantic nationalist revival, working simultaneously through the German states and through Scandinavia, wanted a Valkyrie who selected her warriors on the basis of virtue. A meritocratic vision of the afterlife built to flatter a very modern idea about what makes a hero, and useful to movements that needed a mythic past to justify a political present. He states plainly where that idea comes from, and it is not the Poetic Edda. It has no basis in the medieval sources at all. It is a 19th century political fantasy answering a 19th century political need, projected backward onto a corpus that never asked the question and cannot answer it either. The 20th century then took 4 minutes of Wagner's score, the loudest 4 minutes he ever wrote, and detached them entirely from the scene they were built for. Ride of the Valkyries now scores triumph across 100 films and broadcasts, airborne, victorious, unstoppable, most famously laid under a helicopter assault in Apocalypse Now, attached to a figure whose actual function, in the sources that predate Wagner by 700 years, is to serve a god who has already been told in Völuspá that he loses. The music was composed for the scene of Brunhilde's punishment, not her triumph. What the culture kept from it was only her power, carried loose from the story that explained why she needed it. None of this makes the Helgi poems fraudulent, and none of it should be heard as walking back a single word already spoken about Svava or Sigrun. It does mean the ground beneath even those poems is itself a kind of survival, rather than a direct transmission, and the distinction is worth holding on to for what follows. Margaret Clooney's. Ross's argument is the one worth keeping closest here. Everything called Old Norse myth reaches a modern reader through 13th century Christian Icelandic hands, so the material available to Wagner by 1876 was already once refracted before he refracted it again for an opera house 7 centuries later. 2 layers of glass, laid one over the other, and the figure sealed underneath both of them is older than either layer. She is not made of paper, and she is not made of Bayreuth, and no amount of orchestration changes what the 13th century manuscripts actually preserved before anyone in Germany or Scandinavia had a reason to want her softer. What the ground itself, actual ground, dug with a trowel rather than read from a page, undisturbed by a single romantic composer, has kept of her is a different kind of evidence than any opera house can offer, harder to romanticize and harder to date wrong. And it is where this turns next. A gilded silver woman, 3.5 centimeters from crown to hem, turned up in a farmer's field near Harby on the Danish island of Funen, and has been dated to around the year 800. She stands in a long dress, her hair plaited into a ponytail, held behind her back, one arm extended with what looks like a drinking vessel held out towards something unseen, the other arm bent at her side, holding an object no one has fully identified. She weighs almost nothing in the hand, small enough to close a fist around, and she has weighed a great deal more in the argument that scholars and documentary makers alike have built around her ever since she was pulled out of that field. And Sophie Graslund has studied her as closely as any single object in the Norse material record gets studied, and her conclusion is exact rather than triumphant. Nothing inscribed on the figurine names her. No accompanying text survives to say what she was made to represent. No rune, no label, no context beyond the field she was pulled from. Calling her a Valkyrie is an inference laid over a beautiful silent object, not a reading the object confirms on its own, and Graslund is careful never to let the beauty do the confirming for her. She is not alone in the ground. Leszek Gardella has catalogued a whole scattered family of comparable armed women at Klinta on the island of Åland, at Tiso in Zealand, at Revninga back on Funen, each one carrying some combination of the same details: a shield, a weapon, or a drinking vessel, a long dress cut the same way. Gardella reads the recurrence as a genuine type, a pattern too consistent across too many sites to be accidental. But he will not let a repeated pattern stand in for a settled identity. The figures could be Valkyries, could be goddesses, could be priestesses conducting a ritual now lost, could be portraits of living women whose status the culture wanted, commemorated permanently in silver. A second figurine, smaller and plainer, turned up at Ribe gripping a round shield outright. No ambiguity about the object in her hands, even if there remains every ambiguity about who she is meant to be. Gardella connects the shield grip directly to the shield-bearing Valkyries, named in the 30th stanza of Völuspá, a visual echo of a verbal detail separated by centuries and by medium. Pendants carry the same motif further still, cast in amber and in silver and scattered from Scandinavia out into the Baltic. An armed woman, worn against the skin, close and personal, in a way a buried figurine is not, carried on a journey rather than left in a field. But pendant molds were reused, copied, traded down family lines and across regional markets the way any decorative object travels, and Gardella refuses to read mass production, however widespread it became, as proof of devotion to any single mythological figure. Stone carries a version of the same story, told at a larger scale and raised for anyone passing to see. On several Gotlandic picture stones, a tall woman stands at what looks like a hall door. extending a drinking horn toward a warrior arriving on horseback. On one stone in particular, Jengvide the Fun. The horse beneath that warrior has 8 legs. If the horse is Sleipnir, the scene is Odin's hall receiving its dead, and the woman in the doorway is doing exactly what the poems describe her doing, welcoming the fallen with drink in hand. Gresslund calls that reading plausible. She does not call it settled, because the stone carries no caption. Only the horse, only the door, only the gesture of the horn held out toward a rider who cannot answer. The weakest evidence of all comes from Oseberg, from a torn textile fragment recovered out of a ship burial dated to around 834, which may show a procession of armed women stitched into cloth that has otherwise disintegrated around it. If the reading holds, it would be the earliest material trace of the type by decades, predating every other figurine catalogued here. Gresslund rates it contested and incomplete, and a fragment this damaged, missing most of its own picture, cannot be asked to carry a claim this large on its own. What all of it adds up to, in Gardella's own final accounting, is the honest resting point for a survey built on objects rather than words. A type recurs consistently across figurines and pendants in stone, in a shape that plausibly touches the literary Valkyrie tradition, though plausibility does not amount to proof. Plausibility is exactly as far as an object without a caption can carry an argument, and the ground, however much of it gets turned over in the coming decades, is not going to produce the caption on its own. What it can produce is a dispute, the loudest and most public one in the ground evidence, and, as it turns out, the one least willing to settle. Hjalmar Stolpe opened the grave in 1878 in the trading town of Birka on Bjorka Island, and what he catalogued inside it was a sword, 2 axes, a spear, a shield, a set of armor-piercing arrows, and the skeletal remains of 2 horses. An assemblage so martial, so complete, that for roughly 140 years, no one who studied it thought to question the sex of the person it had been buried around. It became, in textbook after textbook, the exemplary male warrior burial of the Viking Age, reproduced in diagrams as a model of how a fighting man was sent into the ground, cited that way for so long, and by so many, that the identification stopped reading as an interpretation at all, and started reading as settled fact. Charlotte Hidenstierna Jonsson and her co-authors sequenced ancient DNA drawn from the skeleton and published the result in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. XX chromosomes. No Y chromosome signal detected anywhere in the sample. A genetic result no later study has challenged, though scholars disagree sharply about what it implies for the life the buried person lived. What the paper concluded from that finding is where the argument begins, and where a textbook diagram stopped being simple. The authors titled their study, without much room for a softer reading, "A Female Viking Warrior Confirmed by Genomics," though what followed shows scholars disagree about exactly how much that title proves. Other archaeologists pushed back hard on both the framing and the underlying method almost immediately, in print. The objections raised in the years that followed argued that the chamber grave might have held more than one individual, its bones mixed by time, by later disturbance, or by the original 19th century excavation itself, and that a weapon burial on its own can signal inherited status and family lineage as easily as it can signal a life actually spent fighting with those weapons in hand. Neil Price and his co-authors answered both objections at length in Antiquity, defending the contextual integrity of the burial. One individual, undisturbed, no evidence of mixing between separate deposits, and pressing the interpretation further still, reading a complete set of gaming pieces buried alongside the weapons as the signature of someone who planned battles rather than someone who only fought in them, and comparing the whole assemblage directly to the other richest graves excavated at the same cemetery, arguing the two belong to the same social tier, a defense over which scholars disagree. That reading of the gaming pieces remains the single most contested part of Price's paper, the point where even readers otherwise sympathetic to his argument tend to hesitate before agreeing. Gaming pieces have turned up in Viking Age graves that carry no weapons at all, buried with people no one has proposed were warriors, and holding that a full set implies a command role is a considerably larger leap than holding that it implies wealth, leisure, or status inherited rather than earned on a battlefield. Gardella, working from a wider angle than either single paper allows itself, places BJ581 inside a pattern that makes the one grave far less exceptional than the headlines made it sound. Weapon-bearing women's graves recorded at Kaupang in Norway, at Gerdrup in Denmark, at Saffron Walden in England, scattered across 2 centuries and 3 separate regions of the Viking world, none of them producing the same certainty either side of the Berka argument wants. Read that way, BJ Poem 581 stops answering the question it was made to answer in the popular press. The real question was never whether one extraordinary woman fought at Birka. It is what the varied roles of weapon-bearing women across Viking Age society actually were. Ritual specialists, patrons, commanders, fighters, or some mixture the evidence cannot cleanly separate. That is a harder question that does not resolve to a single celebrated grave, however famous that grave has since become. Gardella's sharpest observation cuts underneath both sides of the published dispute, rather than choosing between them. Both papers treat genetic sex as a stand-in for social role, and the two are not the same claim, however often they get treated as interchangeable. Chromosomes describe a body, and only a body. They do not describe a title held, a life lived, a duty performed, or what the community standing around that grave in the 9th century actually called the person lying inside it. And on one point, both papers, for all their disagreement, already agree, in silence rather than in argument. Neither study nor the defense of it ever claims the woman in BJ 581 was a Valkyrie, or that her burial reflects Valkyrie belief in any form whatsoever. That leap was made only afterward, in headlines calling the grave definitive proof that Valkyries were real, a conflation Gardella states plainly the archaeological literature does not support and was never designed to support in the first place. A weapon-bearing woman in the Berka ground and a supernatural chooser of the slain in a poem copied down centuries later are two separate categories of evidence, gathered by two separate disciplines, working from two entirely different kinds of surviving material, and setting them side by side on a headline does not make them the same kind of fact, no matter how badly a headline wants a single, satisfying answer out of a debate that has not produced one on either side. Every claim so far has been checked against the texts and held to exactly what they say, no further. What follows runs that same discipline in reverse. Not what the sources say, but what they never once say, across a corpus large enough that the silences start to mean something. No surviving Norse text has a Valkyrie choose a man for his courage. Not Grimnismal, not Voluspa, not a single skaldic stanza anywhere in the corpus drawn on here. The verb the poems reach for, again and again, is Kjosa, to choose, and it is never once followed by a reason, never a clause explaining why this man and not another. Lindo is blunt about what that absence means. The idea that Valkyries reward merit, that they select the brave and pass over the coward, is a later addition standing on nothing the medieval sources actually say, however satisfying it would be to believe otherwise. There is no test of nerve, no field of honor graded by an unseen judge. She has no wings in any of it either. Every riding Valkyrie named in the primary texts travels on a horse or arrives on foot, hooves and ground, never air. Simek confirms the image of her airborne feathered, rising unaided into the sky is a borrowing lifted in the 18th and 19th centuries from the winged victory figures of Greek and Roman art, and laid over a Norse original who never once flew under her own power in any text that survives. The swan skin she is sometimes said to shed by a riverbank, so that a man who steals it can bind her to him and keep her from flying off. That too is absent, checked carefully against the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, and the family sagas in turn, all of it, and found nowhere. Simek traces the Swan Maiden motif to later German folklore, a story that migrated sideways into the popular idea of the Valkyrie without ever having belonged to her Norse sources in the first place. There is no scale anywhere in the surviving material weighing a soul against its deeds, no ledger of virtue kept and checked before a name is called. Torvil Petre states the working logic plainly. Odin wants effective fighters for a war Voluspa has already told him he loses, and nothing in what survives ties the act of selection to moral worth rather than plain usefulness in that coming fight. A silence the Poetic Edda, Volsunga Saga, and Njal Saga all three keep in exact agreement with each other. Three independent texts, written down at different times by different hands for different purposes, refusing together to say the thing the modern audience assumes without ever having checked. Ellis Davidson notes that, unlike the Disha, who had a named autumn sacrifice recorded under its own word, the Disciplot, no surviving source. records any festival, temple, offering, or named cult act performed for a Valkyrie. She is a figure the poems know intimately, by name, by lineage, by deed, argued over in court poetry, and wept over in the Helgi cycle. And the ritual calendar, so far as anything of it survives at all, does not record her once. She is missing too from every comic register the Edda contains. Absent from Thrymskvida's stolen hammer, from Lokasenna's insults thrown across a hall by a god who insults everyone. Absent everywhere the gods are mocked rather than mourned. Whatever category she belongs to, she's not available to be laughed at. No wings, no scale of judgment, no swan skin, no shrine, no joke made at her expense in 700 years of surviving text. That is a long accounting of what the sources never say, and every item on it has been building quietly toward the same conclusion. The Valkyrie chooses, and nothing in the record ties that choosing to a man's worth. But that conclusion has its own silence left to answer for, and honesty does not get to skip past it just because it arrives last. Nowhere in the surviving texts does a Valkyrie choose the slain entirely on her own initiative. Every instance runs back to a commission from Odin, named in Grimnismal, dispatched in Gylfaginning, invoked by name in Eiriksmal, and in Hakonarmal. Lindo is careful to state this as exactly what it is and no more. An argument from absence, built on a corpus this torn and this incomplete, not a rule any single source states outright and closes the door on, but a pattern read into a silence across the whole surviving record. The counterexample sits inside a poem already told here in full, not in some text held in reserve. Sigrun's shield raised over Helgi's fleet at Frekastein was not loyalty read generously into a gap in the record, and it is not a detail that gets to be quietly set aside because it complicates the case built around it. That is a Valkyrie acting without any commission recorded anywhere in the surrounding text, keeping the man she loves alive, in the plainest possible sense of the word, standing directly against the procurement thesis at the exact moment the thesis needs her not to. Every line naming her comes down through Christian Icelandic hands, copied and arranged more than 2 centuries after the conversion that made those hands Christian in the first place. Reconstructed, Margaret Clunies Ross argues, by scribes reaching back for a belief system they themselves no longer practiced, and could only partly recover from what oral tradition still carried. Clunies Ross states the responsible limit plainly: what survives cannot be read back into a lost pre-Christian belief, but how the Valkyrie was used, in poetry, in court flattery, in saga narrative across 4 centuries of hands, is itself a real and valuable thing to have studied. What is recoverable after every figurine, every grave, and every silence catalogued here is the literature. What produced the literature